This gambit begins with pawn to a4, pawn to a5, knight to f3, knight to c6, followed by bishop to c4. In this position, black typically chooses between the Italian game by playing bishop to c5 or the two knights defense with knight to f6. However, instead of these standard options, you surprise your opponent with the aggressive Rousseau Gambit by playing pawn to f5. This gambit is actually a reversed version of the Vienna game, but instead of playing it with the white pieces, you play it with the black pieces. At first glance, pawn to f5 might seem like a reckless move. You sacrifice a pawn and weaken the light square diagonal, making it appear as if you're playing incorrectly. However, this gambit is so tricky that many of white's natural moves can quickly lead to trouble. In most cases, your opponent will notice that you are attacking their pawn on e4 while simultaneously leaving your pawn on f5 undefended. Because of this, they will likely capture it. After that, you push your own pawn to f4 to seize the initiative. At this point, your opponent starts to realize that something is going wrong. Their knight on f3 is under attack, and they have limited options for where to move it. Your queen controls the g5 and h4 squares, preventing the knight from retreating there. Meanwhile, your knight on c6 covers the e5 and d4 squares, making it appear that the knight has no safe escape squares. In reality, the move knight to d4 is still possible, and it can be quite tricky to deal with. You need to know how to handle it properly, which I will explain shortly. However, most of your opponents will not immediately recognize that this move is available. Seeing no good options, your opponent might think, "What should I do with this knight?" Moving it back to g1 seems very passive, essentially undeveloping the knight. After that, you can continue with pawn to d5, gaining another tempo for your development. Then, you will develop your bishop and eventually regain your pawn on f5. At this point, you are completely dominating the position. It becomes clear that you have outplayed your opponent. They are forced to waste several moves retreating their pieces, while you establish control over the center and dictate the pace of the game. Some opponents, trying to be clever, will instead play queen to e2. Let's not forget that they still believe you are making dubious moves, and they feel the need to punish you for it. Your opponent believes that queen to e2 pins your pawn on e4 and may even help them win it. Since they are still up a pawn, they assume they are in a comfortable position. However, you counter immediately with queen to a7, which not only unpins your pawn on a4, but also renews the same deadly threat. Pawn captures knight on f3. Suddenly, your opponent realizes that their queen moved to e2 was completely ineffective, and they are forced to move their knight back anyway. In fact, queen to e2 is an even worse move because in many variations. It allows you to jump in with knight to d4, attacking both the queen on e2 and the pawn on c2 with tempo. Once again, this demonstrates how tricky the Rousseau Gambit is. Many moves that seem natural or good for white actually lead them straight into disaster. In this position, I recommend playing knight to f6, a move that serves multiple purposes. First, it prevents white's queen from going to h5 and delivering a check. This is one of the minor issues in the Rousseau Gambit. Then, since you have moved your f-pawn, you need to be mindful of potential early checks. However, this is easily stopped by playing knight to f6, which is a natural developing move you would have played anyway. Additionally, knight to f6 helps prepare the strong central break pawn to d5, which not only strengthens your control over the center, but also attacks white's bishop on c4, forcing it to move. Pretty cool, right? Now, what can white do here? They quickly realize that they cannot develop their knight on g1 because your pawn on e4 is restricting its movement. As a result, most opponents will choose one of two moves, knight to c3, simply aiming to develop. Pawn to d3, trying to eliminate your strong pawn on e4, which is also blocking their own knight. However, both of these moves fail badly, often in spectacular fashion. Let's first examine pawn to d3, a move that many opponents play instinctively. In response, you strike immediately with knight to d4, delivering another nasty surprise. You're not just trading material, you're launching an attack. Knight to d4 not only targets white's queen on e2, but it also threatens the pawn on c2, creating serious problems for your opponent. Your opponent cannot afford to let you capture the pawn on c2, because doing so would deliver a check to the king and a fork on the rook, resulting in a devastating loss of material. To prevent this, white must keep guarding the pawn on c2, usually by moving the queen to d1 or queen to d2. However, it doesn't matter where the queen goes. You sacrifice your knight anyway with knight to c2, delivering a check to the king and forking the rook on a 1. Once the knight is captured, you strike again with pawn to d3, unleashing a beautiful discovered attack on white's queen, winning it on the next move. This sequence completely crushes your opponent and exposes just how tricky the Rousseau Gambit can be. Some of your opponents, however, may be lucky enough to avoid this trap. Instead of playing pawn to d3, they might go for knight to c3, but that too leads to disaster in a different way. After this, it may seem difficult for black to continue the attack, but there is still a powerful way forward that you must know. It all begins with knight to d4, following a similar idea, attacking white's queen while also threatening the pawn on c2. This forces white to retreat with queen to d1. Now, the best move to accelerate your attack is pawn to d5, sacrificing a pawn for the sake of rapid development. Since white is attacking this square twice, they will usually capture the pawn on d5. At first, it might seem like white is simply winning material. However, the real advantage for you is that you continue developing your pieces quickly, gaining strong attacking chances in return. Here, being a generous player, you give white a wide range of options for exactly how they would like to be destroyed. What can they do? If they attempt to develop normally with knight to e2, preparing to castle, you immediately respond with bishop to g4. Suddenly, white's knight on e2 is pinned, and once you capture it, you also take white's queen on d1, leaving them completely defenseless. White is simply lost. Since knight to e2 fails miserably, what else can white try? Many opponents will realize that your knight on d4 is extremely annoying, and they will try to chase it away with pawn to c3, hoping to force your knight back to c6. But as we know, the Rousseau Gambit is full of surprises, and we use that to our advantage to surprise your opponent with knight to f3, delivering a check. Even after all these trades, we still make use of this discovered check on the white king. Now, if the king moves, bishop to d3 is a very neat and accurate move, setting up a near checkmate. It becomes a checkmate in just a couple of moves. The king is under attack, the pawn on f3 is removed, and white's queen is forced to retreat along the d-file. Now, let's go back. What if your opponent calculates this line and decides, I'm up a piece, so I'll cover the check with my knight and trade everything on e2 to simplify to an endgame? You reply with bishop to c2, a beautiful deflection. You force the queen to move, and once it does, you play queen takes e2, delivering yet another checkmate. What if your opponent decides to go all out and tries to capture as much as possible with bishop to b7? There are several ways to handle this, but the easiest is simply to move your rook away, attacking the bishop. Notice that your knight controls the c3 square, so the bishop cannot move there and deliver a check to your king as it would be captured. As a result, the bishop must move elsewhere, and then you can break open the position with pawn to 3. This not only attacks the weakness on c2, which is under threat from your bishop and knight, but also creates multiple checkmate threats against the white king. Additionally, the move pawn to e3 opens up even more opportunities. In many variations, there is also the move queen to c5, which applies pressure to both the bishop on b7 and the pawn on c2. All in all, white's position starts to crumble. In most cases, your opponent will capture your pawn on e3, but then you can strike with knight to c2, forking the king and rook, winning the rook on the next move and gaining a decisive material advantage. I hope you understand all variation in this gambit. If you found this video helpful, then like and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.